An army of this size does not need to rush. It moves with patience because time is already on its side. In the spring of 1462, when the Ottoman host began assembling for its northern march, there was no urgency in their preparations. 80,000 soldiers do not gather for uncertainty. They gather because the outcome is assumed long before the first step is taken. Infantry hardened by years of conquest, cavalry trained to break formations in open ground, engineers who had reduced cities to rubble from Anatolia to the Balkans, and artillery that had already proven walls were no longer guarantees of survival. This was not a punitive raid. This was a campaign designed to erase a problem. From the Ottoman perspective, the situation was simple. A small frontier principality had forgotten its place. The tribute had been delayed. Orders had been ignored. Outposts south of the Danube had been attacked. Allowing this defiance to stand would invite instability along an entire frontier. Empires do not fear resistance because of its strength. They fear it because of what it encourages. So the response had to be overwhelming, not just to defeat an enemy, but to remind everyone watching what inevitability looked like. The land awaiting the army offered little reason for concern. Wallachia was poor, thinly populated, and incapable of fielding an army large enough to challenge the Ottomans directly. Its fortifications were modest. Its resources are limited. Its survival had always depended on careful obedience rather than strength. For decades, its rulers had understood this reality. Tributes flowed south. Hostages were sent. Borders remained quiet. It was not honorable, but it was effective. Wallachia survived because it knew when not to resist. That balance had been shattered by one man, a ruler who had lived long enough under Ottoman observation to understand exactly how their power worked. He knew how they marched, how they supplied their armies, how discipline was enforced, and how fear was managed. He also knew something else just as clearly. He knew that Wallachia could not survive another generation of submission. That slow erosion would end the principality without a battle ever being fought. So instead of negotiating, he chose defiance. And by doing so, he forced an empire to respond. From the moment the Ottoman campaign was announced, everyone involved understood the arithmetic. 80,000 against barely 10,000. An army built for open warfare against a land that could barely protect its own roads. There would be no relief force, no allies arriving at the last moment, no decisive battle that could turn the odds. If this war followed conventional rules, it would be over in weeks, and everyone knew it. That certainty shaped the Ottoman advance. The army moved north with confidence earned through repetition. Cities had fallen before. Resistance had collapsed before. Armies larger than Wallachia's entire population had already been broken by this machine. The march itself was a demonstration. Long columns stretched across the landscape. Supply wagons rolled in disciplined order. Camps were laid out like temporary cities, organized, protected, and efficient. This was what imperial power looked like when it expected obedience. Inside Wallachia, the reality felt very different. There were no illusions about victory, no speeches promising triumph, no belief that courage alone could stop what was coming. The people living along the invasion routes understood exactly what an Ottoman campaign meant. They had seen refugees before. They had heard stories from the south. They knew that once the army arrived, the land would not simply be occupied, it would be consumed. Ruler of Wallachia understood this better than anyone, and because he understood it, he did not prepare for a battle. He prepared for something else entirely. He accepted early and without hesitation that he could not defeat the Ottoman army. He could not destroy it. He could not face it in the field. He could not hide behind walls and hope they held. Those options belonged to men who misunderstood what kind of war this was. His goal was not victory. His goal was survival through refusal. Weeks before the Ottomans crossed the Danube, Wallachia began changing in ways that outsiders would not immediately understand. Villages were emptied, not in panic, but under command. Families were ordered to leave early before fear could spread. They took what they could carry and left the rest behind deliberately. Grain was moved north or burned where it stood. Livestock was driven into forests and hills under armed escort. Mills were destroyed so flour could not be produced. Storehouses were stripped. Wells were filled or fouled. Nothing was left behind that could sustain an army moving at imperial scale. This was not destruction born of desperation. It was destruction born of calculation. Every decision was measured against a single question. What does an army of 80,000 need in order to keep moving? And then that need was removed. At the same time, Wallachia's own forces were deliberately dismantled as a conventional army. There would be no banners to rally around, no formations to crush, no single camp to surround. Instead, the ruler broke his men into small mounted groups, rarely more than a few dozen riders each. They were chosen not for bravery in battle, but for knowledge of terrain. Men who knew which forest paths swallowed sound, which marshes could hold a horse and which could not, which hills could hide movement until the last moment. Their orders were simple and unforgiving. Do not hold ground, do not seek battle, do not chase success. Strike only when escape is guaranteed. Disappear immediately afterward. This was not a war meant to be seen clearly, it was a war meant to be felt. When the Ottoman army finally crossed into Wallachia, it did so with the confidence of inevitability. No resistance greeted them. No army stood in defiance. No fortresses closed their gates in panic. The roads were open. The land lay quiet. At first, this absence seemed like confirmation that the campaign would unfold as expected. But absence has a way of becoming unsettling when it persists too long. The fields were empty. The villages are silent. The wells are untrustworthy. The army marched on anyway because it always had, because it was built to, because nothing had ever truly stopped it before. And that was the moment the war actually began. At first, nothing happened. That was the most unsettling part. The Ottoman army moved deeper into Wallachia, expecting resistance to appear eventually. A line of men, a fortified position, something that could be pointed to and dealt with. But the land remained empty. Roads stretched ahead without movement. Villages stood abandoned, doors swinging slightly in the wind. The fires were cold. Wells smelled wrong. The army marched through silence that felt intentional. An army can fight enemies. It struggles with absence. The first losses did not come from combat. They came from routine. A scouting party sent ahead failed to return. This was not unusual on its own. Scouts disappear in every campaign. Another group was sent to investigate. They found horses without riders, tracks leading into forest and then nowhere. No bodies, no signs of battle, just absence layered on absence. Messengers began to vanish next. Orders sent between units did not arrive. Paths that looked safe during the day felt narrow at night. Riders moved faster. Guards were doubled. Still, the army advanced. Discipline held. Confidence did not vanish all at once. It eroded. The first attacks came suddenly and ended before they could be understood. A small foraging group spread out in a field, confident that numbers alone provided safety. Riders appeared from behind a low ridge, struck quickly, and vanished before weapons could be fully raised. The entire encounter lasted moments. When reinforcements arrived, the attackers were gone. The ground was quiet again. Too quiet, at night fires appeared where supply wagons had stood hours earlier. Horses screamed. Smoke rose briefly, then faded. No enemy remained to chase. Guards tightened their grip on weapons. Men slept in armor. Sleep itself became shallow, fractured, dangerous. These were not victories meant to be counted. They were interruptions, each one small, each one is incomplete, and each one designed to leave survivors. That was deliberate. Not everyone was killed. One or two men always escaped. They returned shaken, speaking quickly at first, then more quietly as they realized what they were describing. They said the attacks came from nowhere. The riders moved without sound. That prisoners were taken alive, and then they hesitated, because what happened next was harder to explain. They spoke of waiting, of being tied and left alone, of realizing something was going to happen long before it did. Whether every detail was true did not matter. Fear does not require accuracy. It only requires repetition, and the story spread faster than the riders who caused them. As days passed, the physical strain became visible. Soldiers marched longer routes because familiar roads no longer felt safe. Horses weakened as fodder ran low. Clean water was hard to trust. Wells were inspected, then avoided. Hunger did not arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly, making tempers short and judgment uneven. Discipline tightened in response. Guards were punished more harshly. Orders were enforced with threats instead of routine. But fear cannot be commanded away. It seeps into pauses, into glances exchanged between men standing watch, into the moment before sleep when the forest feels closer than it should. The Ottoman army was still powerful, still organized, still capable of destroying anything it could catch, but it could not catch what refused to be found. Wallachian riders remained invisible. They did not attack on a schedule. They did not repeat patterns long enough to be anticipated. Some nights passed quietly, others erupted briefly and then fell silent again. The uncertainty mattered more than the damage. Soldiers began to listen to the dark in ways they never had before. Every rustle sounded deliberate, every shadow felt watched. Vlad observed all of this from the edges. His scouts tracked the army's movement without engaging it directly. They learned where units relaxed after long marches. They noted which camps grew careless once fires were lit and armor loosened. They watched how confidence returned after quiet nights, only to fracture again after sudden violence. He did not rush. He understood that fear grows best when it is allowed to breathe. The Ottoman commanders still believed in the campaign. From their perspective, the army was moving forward. No major battle had been lost. No fortress had stopped them. The enemy refused to fight, which could only mean weakness. But belief and morale are not the same thing. Belief can exist even as morale fractures underneath it. By the time the army halted to make camp deep inside Wallachia, exhaustion had dulled instinct. Men were tired of marching through nothing, tired of guarding against shadows, tired of sleeping lightly. The land ahead seemed quieter, the attacks had thinned. It felt like resistance was running out of strength. That pause felt earned. The camp formed as it always did, long rows of tents. Fires lit in careful lines, weapons stacked nearby, armor loosened, food cooked. For the first time in days, soldiers allowed themselves to believe they could rest. On the first night, guards remained alert. On the second, the routine returned. On the third, confidence settled in. That third night was not chosen by chance. It was chosen because fear had done its work and routine had returned just enough to be broken. And somewhere beyond the firelight, beyond the outer ring of tents, men were already moving, slowly, silently, carrying torches they did not intend to use until it was too late. The Wallachian riders did not approach the Ottoman camp with speed. Speed would have drawn attention. They moved slowly, carefully, allowing their horses to place each step without sound. There were no torches, no signals, no whispered orders. Each group already knew its path, its timing, its exit. This was not an attack meant to adapt in the moment. It had been decided long before the first rider moved. They wore Ottoman clothing taken from earlier raids. No disguises meant to fool close inspection, only enough to pass at a distance in the dark, where tired men expected to see movement and no longer questioned every shadow. The outer perimeter was crossed with disturbing ease. Too many soldiers moved through the camp at night for every figure to be challenged. Confidence had replaced caution, exactly as fear had trained it to. Inside the camp, the illusion of control felt complete. Fires burned low. Men sat instead of standing watch. Some slept with weapons nearby. Others had placed them just out of reach, trusting that size alone was protection. Horses were tied loosely, heads low, breathing slow. This was what safety looked like to an army that believed nothing could reach it here. The silence broke without warning, and not with sound, but with flame. Torches arced through the darkness and landed on canvas. Fire bloomed instantly, feeding on dry fabric and oil. At the same moment, horses were cut loose. They bolted in panic, screaming, crashing through ropes and tents, trampling men still half asleep. In seconds, the camp transformed from order into confusion. Men woke up choking on smoke, grabbing for weapons they could not immediately find. Orders were shouted and drowned out by other orders. Units collided in narrow lanes between tents. Shadows moved everywhere. No one knew where the attack was coming from or how large it was. That uncertainty mattered more than numbers. Within the chaos, the Wallachians pressed inward. They did not stop to fight where resistance thickened. They flowed around it, striking isolated guards, cutting through gaps, pushing deeper toward the center of the camp. The goal was not destruction. It was close. To reach the place where command tents clustered, where the belief in control lived. This was the most dangerous moment of the entire campaign. If the attackers slowed, they would be surrounded. If they hesitated, they would be crushed by weight alone. Firelight flickered across armor and faces twisted in confusion and rage. Steel clashed in spaces too tight for full swings. Blades scraped shields. Men fell under hooves. For long minutes, no one knew which side held control. Then the Empire began to wake up. Elite units formed lines. Drums beat sharp commands. The sound cut through chaos like a blade. Order did not return all at once, but it began to push back. The camp was too large, too disciplined to collapse entirely, and Vlad knew it. This attack had never been meant to last until dawn. It was meant to prove something. The signal to withdraw did not come as a shout. It came as movement. Small groups peeled away from the fight, slipping back into darkness, breaking contact before pursuit could lock in. Some withdrew cleanly. Others fought their way out through fire and smoke, cutting down anyone who blocked escape and then vanishing into gaps that should not have existed. The withdrawal was not clean. It could not be. Narrow lanes became traps, ropes fell, poles collapsed, men tripped over bodies, smoke blinded, horses screamed. Ottoman cavalry attempted pursuit, but pursuit requires space, and space did not exist inside a burning camp. Vlad remained with the last wave. He stayed long enough to be seen. Long enough to draw attention, long enough to become the threat that had to be answered. Then at the edge of the camp, he turned and disappeared into terrain where pursuit meant breaking formation and losing men to ground that refused to behave predictably. By the time the fires were controlled, the attackers were gone. Morning revealed what the night had done, not just bodies, meaning men had been killed where they slept. Guards had died without raising alarms. The heart of the camp had been reached, touched, violated. The army still stood. Its numbers were still overwhelming, its banners still flew, but something essential had been damaged. The belief that size alone guaranteed safety was gone. The march resumed at first light, but it was no longer the same march. Fires were watched instead of trusted. Guards stood even in daylight, conversations shortened. Laughter disappeared. The road ahead felt closer than it should have and far more dangerous. No more attacks came. That silence was worse. The land ahead offered no resistance, no surrender, no explanation, just empty space leading toward the capital. And in that space, imagination did the work of an army. When the vanguard finally slowed near Târgoviște, it was not because of defenders. It was because something waited ahead that did not fit the logic of war. Wooden stakes rose from the earth in long, ordered lines, hundreds at first, then thousands. And on everyone stood a body placed deliberately facing the road the army had to take. This was not a battlefield. It was a message, and the army had no choice but to read it. The Ottoman army did not stop when it reached the field of stakes. It could not afford to. Armies that hesitate in front of messages invite weakness to spread. Orders were given. The columns moved forward. Men passed between the dead in silence, eyes fixed ahead, breathing shallow, careful not to look too long at faces that felt uncomfortably close to their own. No one needed to explain what this display meant. It was not meant to block the road. It was meant to walk with them. Beyond the stakes, Targoviste lay open. There were no defenders on the walls, no arrows, no fire. The gates were not barred. The capital of Wallachia did not resist because resistance was not the point. The city had already been stripped of anything that mattered. The storehouses were empty. Wells were fouled or dry. Streets echoed under marching boots. Doors swung in the wind. It was a city prepared not for defense but for abandonment. The Ottomans occupied it anyway. Banners were raised, units took positions, patrols were established. On paper, the campaign had reached its objective. The capital had fallen, the road north was open, and yet nothing felt finished. There was no celebration. An army knows when it has won. This did not feel like victory. Vlad had not been captured, he had not surrendered, he had not offered terms. He had simply vanished again, leaving behind proof of how patiently he was willing to wait. The city was held, but the land around it remained hostile, silent, and empty by design. Every supply had to be hauled from far behind along roads that had already proven unsafe. Every foraging party required escorts. Every night demanded heightened guard. Fires were kept small. Patrols moved constantly. The army could occupy ground, but it could not rest on it, and rest is what keeps campaigns alive. The psychological toll continued to grow. Soldiers spoke less. Even officers chose their words carefully. Every shadow beyond the city walls felt deliberate. Every delay felt intentional. The fear was no longer sharp. It was constant. That was worse. From a strategic perspective, the problem became impossible to ignore. Staying longer meant feeding 80,000 men from lines that could be cut at will. Pushing deeper meant stretching those lines even further into terrain that refused to behave like a battlefield. And Vlad was still free. He had not been forced into open conflict. He had not been cornered. He had not been neutralized. The purpose of the campaign had not been to take a city. It was to remove a problem. That problem still existed. An empire can afford losses. It cannot afford uncertainty that offers no end. The longer the army remained, the higher the cost rose without any promise of resolution. Wallachia could not be pacified by occupation. It could only be endured, and endurance favors the land, not the invader. The decision to withdraw was never announced as a failure. Empires do not speak that way. Orders were framed as redeployment, as recalibration, as prudence. But the columns turned south. The artillery was pulled away. The camps were dismantled. The march reversed itself, moving back through the same empty land, now remembered differently. Vlad did not pursue it openly. He did not need to. His objective had never been to destroy the Ottoman army. That would have required battles he could not win. His objective was simpler and far more effective, to make occupation unbearable, to prove that Wallachia could not be held without a cost higher than it was worth. In that, he succeeded. The campaign ended without a decisive battle. Without a heroic last stand, without a moment where one side clearly shattered the other. And that is why it is remembered. Because an empire learned something it preferred not to, that power does not always move in straight lines. That size does not guarantee safety. That certainty, once broken, does not return easily. In later years, Vlad would lose allies. He would gain enemies. He would not die peacefully. History would twist his image, exaggerate it, simplify it, turn a campaign of calculation into legend and myth. But in 1462, there was nothing mythical about what happened. There was only a small country that understood it could not win by strength, and an empire forced to admit that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who refuses to fight the war you prepared for. And when the Ottoman army finally crossed back over the Danube, it did so intact, undefeated, and forever changed. Because it had learned that even an empire can be made to hesitate,